Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Olathe City Hall. We're so glad to have so many of you here today. It's a building that we opened up in 2001, and over the last 16 years, we've hosted many city council meetings. I'm Mike Copeland, Mayor of Olathe, so I've been to many of those, planning commission meetings and community forums, many town halls. Congressman Yoder has, I believe, done 6 town halls here, and his predecessor, Congressman Moore, used the facility as well as our senators. And so it's a great place for people to come together, to engage, to have good dialogue. We might not agree with one another, but it's an essential part of our democratic process. So welcome to City Hall. And I brought my junior mayor with me today, Joshua. And the junior mayor is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. So would you please join me in standing for our pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. It's now my pleasure to turn this program over to our moderators, Steve Kraske and Colleen McCain Nelson. Welcome.
Mayor, thank you very much, and welcome to all of you to the Town Hall Forum sponsored by the Kansas City Star's editorial board. It's great to have you all here. It's great to have you participating in this event tonight. Let me just repeat what the mayor just said. To my far right is the editor of the editorial board of the Kansas City Star, Colleen Nelson. She's my boss, just so we understand each other here. And in the middle, obviously, Congressman Kevin Yoder. This would be a good time for a round of applause. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
And I'd like to welcome you as well and introduce you to the Star's editorial board, the host of tonight's event. The entire editorial board is here tonight. We have Melinda Henneberger, Mary Sanchez, Derek Donovan, Dave Hellings hiding in the back. And also here tonight we have the publisher of the Kansas City Star, Tony Berg, also hiding in the back.
I should say that I'm Steve Kraske. Yes, absolutely. And I should say that I'm Steve Kraske, also a member of the board. Our goal tonight is to do something unusual, which is to have a civil conversation here with our local member of Congress. In fact, we're going to insist on civility as we go through this evening. Colleen and I have a couple of questions for the congressman to open up the proceedings here. Then we'll turn to questions from you on short order. And members of the board have a microphone. They'll be coming to you. We'll be calling on some of you to ask the questions that you've submitted to us this weekend. And just one point of clarity, you all are here because you were picked through a random computer program. And I know this because Colleen and I spent Saturday morning picking you using that random computer program. I want to assure you it was random. That's why you're all here. We went through the spreadsheet from those of you who submitted your names and picked your names out using those random numbers. An important point here, we prefer no speeches tonight. Ask your question as directly and as succinctly as you can so we can reserve that time for Congressman Yoder to address your question as fully as he possibly can. And also tonight we'll be taking questions from the Star Editorial Board's Facebook Live website, so that'll be happening as we go along this evening.
And just for the record, Congressman Yoder has not seen any of the questions that we'll ask tonight. We asked you all to give us a sense of what topics you'd like to discuss, just to make sure that we cover a range of topics and instead of just focusing on a couple of them. And the Facebook Live questions will be coming in real time, but every question will be a surprise to Congressman Yoder, as he can attest. And just so you know, the Kansas City Star is hosting this event because the editorial board has, on its pages, encouraged members of Congress to hold town halls. And if we can help make that happen, then we'd love to be part of that process. So we're planning to host more town hall events, more community conversations in the future, and stay tuned for more details about that.
Congressman Yoder, you wanted to give an opening statement, and you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Colleen, and thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. It is my distinct pleasure to be your elected representative of Congress and to have the opportunity to have this dialogue. Town hall meetings and I want to make sure I'm in the camera view here, but town hall meetings and conversation are very important to me. We've done a lot of town hall meetings over the years, and so I'm excited to have one here tonight. As Mayor Copeland said, and thank you for his introduction, for his appearance tonight, and letting us use this facility. I think this is our 6th one we've had here at the City of Olathe, and so tonight's an opportunity to ask a lot of questions, cover a lot of ground. We're going to try to get through as many questions as possible. It's a real honor to represent the 3rd District. As you all know, it's Johnson, Wyandotte County and Miami County. And as someone who grew up in Kansas, spent my life as a farm kid, I never really thought I'd have the chance to be your voice in the U.S. House, traveling to Washington, D.C. for you. My wife and I live in Overland Park with our 2 little girls. And Brooke is here if you want to wave, sweetie. Thank you for being here tonight. And it's really important to me that we work together as a country and as a community. And as you've seen, of course, the anger and hatred displayed in everywhere from Charlottesville to a shooting that occurred in Congress. A member of Congress was shot in a baseball field. There are great problems and challenges in this country. My hope and goal is that we can work together, talk to one another, and solve problems together. That doesn't mean we don't disagree. That doesn't mean there aren't Republicans and Democrats in this room and independents who see the world completely different and have different perspectives on how they think we should solve problems. I hope at the end of the day, though, we all want the very best for our country, that we're all Americans first. I know that our children aren't Republican or Democratic children. They're the future of our country. And so hopefully, ultimately, whether we're talking about health care or national security, we may have different solutions on how to get there, but we hopefully all want the same goals, and our motives are similar. We just debate about how to get there. And so thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity to show the country. I think that we can have a very civil conversation together, and that we can really be an example of how people with differing opinions can get in a room and discuss issues and build a more perfect union. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I'll let Steve and Colleen get things started.
Well, let's get started. Congressman, I wanted to begin with a question about some comments that Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee made the other day. He's a member of your party. And I should point out that he slammed the president for his handling of the protests in Charlottesville. And the senator said it's time for radical changes in the White House. And then, Congressman, he said this, the president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. Give me a yes or no here if you would. Do you agree with Senator Corker?
I don't agree with his statement in totality. I don't. I believe that in many ways, and when the president's focused on national security, or job creation, or reforming government, reducing regulations, changing the way we do business in this country as it relates to bloated government programs, I think he's on the right track. When the president is making personal digs at reporters or attacking civil rights leaders, like he did to John Lewis earlier in the year, I stood up and made comments about that and criticized the president for that. I thought his comments on the what we all saw in Charlottesville were wrong. I think he should have been more direct and more clear about that. And so my position is that when the president's wrong, I'll call him out on it. When he's right, we're going to work with him on things. And it was my position with President Obama. Ultimately, my job is to represent all of you. My job is to put Kansans first, no matter who's in the White House, and that's what I will do. And so, I get up every day optimistic that we'll be able to have the president lead us in a direction we want to go that day, and that we can support him in doing that. And when he doesn't, then we have to criticize or suggest an alternative route. And we can certainly discuss more this evening about examples of where we've done that and what we need to do further.
Some of his critics, his harshest critics, have said the president has lost the moral authority to lead the nation. Do you agree with that?
I don't agree with that. I do think the president made a big mistake in not being clear and direct that white supremacy is evil, that these racist groups in Charlottesville do not represent American values, that their viewpoints are not just another argument in a political debate, that they're wrong and that there aren't two sides to this matter. And I believe when we don't speak clearly and directly about that, we're giving oxygen and encouragement to those groups. And that's why I immediately came out and made a statement. And I think the president needs to, certainly rethink his words. I think on Monday he did a better job than he came back on Tuesday, and I think did not speak clearly to that, and in many ways let people think that he might have thought there were two sides to the story. I don't believe there are. There is one side here. One side is evil and wrong, trying to turn back the clock on discrimination, and the other side is the American people. And that's my position on it. I think the president needs to hear from us on that, and as the voice of this community, that's what I've been saying.
Talking for a minute more about the president, there's a new report out today suggesting that Mitch McConnell has said privately that he's not sure whether President Trump can salvage his presidency. So we're in late August now. We haven't seen any major legislation pass since President Trump was inaugurated. Do you have doubts about what can be accomplished under President Trump? And do you think at this point we need to kind of temper our expectations for what Congress can do?
Well, first of all, I'll take issue with the no major legislation comment. So since the beginning of the year, the House has passed over 420 pieces of legislation, over 40 of which have been signed into law. The House's productivity has been, you'd have to go back to George H.W. Bush's first year to have a new administration with a new president pass more legislation in the House. Now, the Senate has not been able to get a lot of those bills to the president's desk. But in terms of legislation we've passed numbers of veterans bills. One of them was just signed this last week by the president, the Educational GI Benefits Forever legislation. We're now spending more on veterans than we're spending than the rest of the world spending combined. We've passed foster care legislation. We've passed our appropriations bills earlier in the year that increased funding for national defense, increased money for the NIH, increased funding for Head Start, and did not do some of the cuts maybe the administration wanted. We came together in a bipartisan way to fund those priorities. We gave the first raise, the biggest raise to American soldiers in 8 years. And so I think there are some very significant things that have been moving along. For example, legislation that I led on passed unanimously in the House in February, the Email Privacy Act, the legislation that requires the Fourth Amendment to apply to all of our emails. Right now it only applies to paper mail. This bill passed unanimously in the House, and it was endorsed by groups all the way from the Heritage Foundation to the ACLU and groups in between. And that's the idea that our government needs a warrant if it's going to read our emails, or it needs to have probable cause or due process. So I just give those as some examples of, Colleen, of where the House is passing legislation, in many cases unanimously. Many of these bills are bipartisan or have significant amounts of both parties supporting them. Where we haven't been able to do is on the key issue of health care, get a bill through the House and Senate. The House has passed a bill. The Senate, I think, was close but didn't get there, and I think we're going to certainly go back to the drawing board. I know we'll talk about health care more this evening. And then the fall, we'll go into tax reform. And so I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think all of us, hopefully, no matter where we are on the political spectrum, root for our government, root for our president to succeed, even if we disagree on the direction he's taking us. We want the country to improve, and so I think we've got to head in that direction.
Let's go to questions from you all here. Questions about President Trump. Jake McMillan, Christy Crossley, if you're here, raise your hands and we'll give you a microphone and here you go. Jake?
Come on over, man. Big chance.
And Christy, are you here? Yeah, good, Christy. Yeah.
I'll hold it.
I don't even know which one of the many questions that was.
Fire away, whatever you want to know.
God, I'm not prepared for that. I'm imagining that my question had something to do with, because you had come out last week in response to the Charlottesville murder, and you've already kind of commented on that, and so I don't really have much follow-up for that question. If you want to jump to my...
Go ahead.
I had a question regarding healthcare. The majority of your constituents would not choose to repeal and replace Obamacare. Why are you still voting in that manner?
Well, I believe the majority of my constituents want to see healthcare in this country improved. They want to see us fix the broken parts of our healthcare system and keep the parts that work. And if you look at the legislation that passed the House, there were many people that wanted to do a straight repeal the health care law and allow eventually states to handle all that, or allow individuals to handle it. And there are others who want to move towards a government-run system. My goal on health care is to figure out how we can repair the broken private insurance markets while keeping in place important protections that were in Obamacare for people with pre-existing conditions, making sure we don't put caps back in place that would people would run out of health insurance, and allow people 26 and younger to stay on their parents' health coverage. That requires us to, I think, make reforms in a way that would bring more insurers back to the market, create more competition, give people more options for health care coverage. Right now in this country, there are over 1,000 counties that have one insurer. Johnson County and Wyandotte County, for example, Blue Cross Blue Shield recently announced that they were leaving the individual markets, leaving us temporarily with no insurer. We're working to get another insurer up and improved for next year. But there are many counties that don't have an insurer yet going into next year. We've got to figure out how to fix the broken private insurance markets so that people have options, have choice, and that competition can help drive down the insurance costs. It's not certainly the whole cure, but I think that's part of it. At the same time, we need to make sure that we keep in place protections for people with pre-existing conditions and other things, as I've mentioned. We either do that, or I think we ultimately move towards a single-payer, government-run healthcare system, which I know certainly people would like. And I don't believe that a Medicare or Medicaid for all system in which we force every constituent in my district to go on to that health care, removing their private insurance, is what my constituents want. I don't believe that if you go door to door and talk to people and you say, would you like the government to force you to lose your private health insurance and go on to Medicaid? Right? So, in my opinion, that's not the direction we want to go. And I'd like our government to work to find ways to provide a system in which we can have private insurance in this country still, not be outlawed by our federal government. And that's the direction I'm heading. And hopefully my commitment is to build a healthcare system that is affordable, that is competitive, that has lots of innovation as opposed to regulation, that has focuses on how we build markets as opposed to mandates. All that's very important. But I will say ultimately, hopefully what we all want is a healthcare system that ensures those things, no matter how we build it, that we have those values.
Congressman, the Republican plan that you all passed kicked more than 20 million people off of health care, according to the CBO. What about that?
Right. So it's important we look at the CBO numbers, right? And I chair a committee on your behalf, the legislative branch subcommittee that oversees the CBO, and we actually gave them even more money this year in our committee, and that bill's passed the House. So I'm not here someone who comes up and says the CBO is the problem. But we do need to look at their numbers. We do need to look at what they actually said. So, Steve, your point is that they're going to throw 20 million people off their coverage. Well, if you look at their numbers, you go through them, the 22 million people that they suggest would not have coverage under their position, you have to go through each category. First of all, 8 million of those 22 million people are people that the CBO still estimates will get onto the exchanges. There's 10 million people on. They suggest we'll get to 18 million. So there's 8 million people that don't have coverage today under the exchanges that the CBO says would somehow get thrown off coverage, but they don't have it today. So there's 8 million people that don't even have it. So they're not getting it now. They have 5 million people they have in that list are people that are in states that haven't expanded Medicaid. So they work off one assumption that 8 million people are going to go into these markets when we're losing insurers, and some counties don't have insurers, so nobody's really would believe we're going to have 8 million new people into the exchanges. They also estimate that 5 million people are going to go on to Medicaid from all the states that haven't expanded. No one really believes that's going to happen either. That's 13 of the 22 million people. Then you go to, they have 7 million people that they say would choose not to keep coverage if they lose the individual mandate. 4 million are people that have employer coverage that if they weren't mandated to keep the employer coverage would no longer take it. And 3 million are people that have Medicaid that would stop taking free Medicaid if there was no mandate. So that gets you to 20 million people that either don't have coverage now, which is 13 million, or 7 million that would actually give up coverage that they're getting that's either free or heavily subsidized. So when you look at that, that's not throwing 22 million people off their health insurance. I don't want to do that. I don't want to see Congress do that. So I think it's important that we understand and study the CBO numbers. Additionally, the CBO actually says that premiums will go down. Can you imagine your premium going down? You're getting a bill that would be less. So we've got to take the CBO numbers, and look at those and study that one as well. But I think the CBO is important to this debate. When you look at, you're not throwing 22 million people off, that 20 million either are not getting coverage now or would choose not to get it. I think it's an important aspect of that.
Let's go to the next question. Your name is?
Christy Crossley. Hi. I heard you just say you were optimistic about the Trump administration. With the tweeting and the incoherent statements, and explain to me how you think he's fit and competent for office and what you think of the 25th Amendment.
Okay. Well, I will tell you that I think when the president is focused on these things that we talked about earlier, when the president's talking about job creation, when he's appointing, I think he's appointed certainly people to his cabinet in positions that Nikki Haley, for example, and others, I think are doing a very good job. There are others that maybe folks disagree with, but I think the president has built an apparatus at the cabinet that is in many ways strong. Not every single one of them. I think the president's focus on getting America back to work, growing the private sector, creating jobs, to me, is an important focus in this country that we had lost, in my opinion, under the previous administration. And so I think those are welcome changes. I think most of us understand, I believe, that government is too big, or at least too bloated. The bureaucracy needs to be changed. So when the president's talking about taking one, every time you take put a new regulation on, you have to take two off. Reforming the tax code. I think all those things are very important. I mean, I watched this president's speech last night. I thought the president spoke clearly and directly to national security issues. And so I understand that the president's become a controversial figure in many ways. But my goal is to work with the president, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, or whether it would have been Hillary Clinton. I didn't stand up every day and criticize the president. I don't stand up every day and criticize the last president, because my goal is to figure out how we can work together and solve problems. That's my job on your behalf, and I'll keep doing that. I know a number of people have said you mentioned the 25th Amendment, like to see the president relieved from power. I can tell you that, my first 6 years in office, we had plenty of people calling, asking why we hadn't impeached President Obama. Now we have people calling, asking why we haven't impeached President Trump. I think the president's been duly elected. He deserves the right and chance to lead this country, and there will be certainly opportunities to continue to debate that.
So we had a number of people who wanted to talk about healthcare with you, so we'll take a couple more healthcare questions. So if Ann Zebley and Laura Gregar are here, if you could
over here,
raise your hands. Laura, are you here? Okay.
Hi, Ann. I don't move as fast as I used to.
Run. Okay, I actually have mine written down so I don't mess it up.
Good.
Okay, many insurers have stated that the reason that they have raised premiums so drastically or pulled out of the ACA marketplace altogether is because of the uncertainty of receiving the cost-sharing reimbursements that were supposed to be part of the ACA. With the failure to repeal the Affordable Care Act, what will you do moving forward to ensure that these required reimbursements are guaranteed in order to stabilize the insurance market?
Well, I do think we have a commitment to work to ensure that we don't do damage to the markets while we're trying to fix them. So I'm not one of these people who says, well, we ought to just let it fall apart, or, that's not our responsibility. These are real lives. These are real people. These are folks in this room. These are people across my community. These are family members, people we all know that we're talking about. This isn't some philosophical debate, although it might appear that way in our national politics. So, I'm committed to doing what we need to do to stabilize and bring insurers into the market while we fix the broken parts of Obamacare. I will continue to work in that direction. It is not my intention, or I don't agree with some of those who say we ought to somehow just let it fall apart, because that will make the case or make a political point. This isn't about scoring political points. This, to me, is about getting something done that makes the healthcare system better. And I remain open to ideas, to work together with folks like yourself or others in this country who have ideas to get there. And I think ultimately, to get a healthcare system that we all love and appreciate, we need to work towards bipartisanship. I think one of the challenges with the system that we passed is it was only Democrats that passed it. Now we have a solution that only Republicans have passed. Someday, and I hope sooner than later, and of course, I work with Emmanuel Cleaver on a number of issues. I have a ton of bipartisan bills that I'm pushing on a number of issues. We would come to a bipartisan solution to fix and repair the healthcare system. So happy to,
My specific question was, what is Congress going to do to make sure that the actual law of the land right now is being enforced and these payments are being made?
Well,
instead of a month by month, we
Right.
might pay you or we might not.
well, of course, we would make it clear, I think, continue to make it clear to the administration that when we put money into appropriations, that we expect those dollars to be spent on federal purposes. We've had problems in the last administration with the administration refusing to enforce the law. That gave a lot of Republicans frustration. You know, there were laws in the books, and the administration said, we're not going to defend those. That, I think, made people frustrated that, well, then you're essentially legislating from the executive branch. At the same time, in this administration, if they were to ignore the laws in the books or ignore the dollars that have been appropriated, then that would be inconsistent with this division of powers and separation of powers. What we've been challenged with in the last administration and this one is how we enforce from the legislative branch. We sued the last administration at one point. The House sued the Obama administration, actually got standing. And so there are models to do that. I'd hope it wouldn't come to that. I hope we'd be able to work together and do that. And so far, it looks like that the administration is going to continue to fund those. But I certainly understand the point you're making, and we'll certainly keep an eye on it and do what Congress can do. Okay?
Right over here,
Dave
Dave.
makes his way to Laura. We've been getting a lot of questions from Facebook Live, so let's jump in with one question from
Right.
our folks watching on Facebook Live, and then we'll come to you, Laura. Lena Fry, who's watching, says, do you still stand with Paul Ryan's tax plan after seeing the Kansas experiment collapse? There certainly a lot of comparisons have been made between
Right.
what happened in Kansas to what President Trump is proposing and what's being talked about by Paul Ryan on the federal level. How do you view those as?
Sure. Well, I will tell you, first of all, I think we do need tax reform in this country. I think when you look at a tax code that is 4 million words, 10,000 pages, Americans spent 8.6 billion hours last year complying with the federal tax code. That's the equivalent of 4.3 million jobs, and it represents the economic output of 36 of 50 states. So I think all of us want tax reform. I know a lot of Democrats who want tax reform. I know a lot of Republicans that want tax reform. We want simplification. We want it to be fair. We want it to be flatter. We want to make sure everyone's paying their fair share. That means corporations. That means individuals. That means a system in which we all believe in. That's something we all should want as an American people. Of course, the devil's in the details. I'm not one of these who believes that you just, cut taxes as deep as you want and revenue just pours in. I believe that we should work to pay for any tax cuts we want with offsetting reductions in exemptions or other reforms in government. And that's I think the goal of tax reform. I think that's what the Speaker would like to do as well. And if not, then certainly that's the sentiment I would echo. I also believe in tax reform that it must be focused on everyone. And a tax reform that just only helps certain people is not tax reform for all of us. And so I've been leading by example on that. I introduced a bill in July with a Democratic colleague of mine from Florida that would increase the child care tax credit. We know a lot of working families, one of their biggest line items on their monthly expenses is child care. In some cases, it's more than their rent, more than their mortgage payment. And so when I look at working families and what they're struggling with, I want to make sure tax reform helps them the most. And so this legislation, I'm hoping to get some national support from. And more than anything, what it does, besides increase the tax credit for child care and allow the savings accounts to increase by 50%, it indexes them so they continue to grow as child care expenses continue to grow. But lastly, it's refundable. Meaning that if you're someone who doesn't have a lot of income, guess what? You still have child care expenses. And they're even a bigger part of your monthly expenditures. We make that tax credit refundable, and that helps a lot of families at the poverty level. And so I think tax reform has to be done in a way that it helps everyone. And so, I don't know exactly what's ultimately going to be in the House's proposal. I think Kansas made some mistakes when they moved on their tax bill. And I think you have to have the reforms in place to pay for the tax changes you want to make. But ultimately, the goal would be to lower rates for everyone, repatriate dollars that are overseas. There's $3 trillion in tax revenue that's around the globe that we can't get back to the U.S. because we're the only country in the world that has this tax system the way it is, and that's a bipartisan plan that Democrats and Republicans both support. That brings in revenue that allows you to buy down rates for the rest of us. And then as well, then you want simplification. One of the proposals we're looking at would allow 90% of tax filers to fill out their income taxes on a postcard. To me, that's welcome change, no matter whether you are in a blue state or red state, or whether Republican or Democrat, that's welcome change. And ultimately what we want from all this tax reform is we want simplicity, we want lower rates, we want economic growth, we want the opportunity to get more small business growth, we want capital to stay in the United States. And if you get that economic growth, you create lots of jobs, you bring in more revenue into government, you pay down the national debt. And so this is an area where I hope we can be bipartisan and we can actually accomplish something. It has happened many times. They did tax reform in the 80s, Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. They did tax reform in the early 2000s with the Republicans and Democrats in Congress and President Bush. That had huge bipartisan votes. That's where I hope we can go, and I hope our better discourse and our leaders in this country can work together to get there.
Question over here. Stand up, I gotta hold this.
Oh, thank you. As a healthcare professional, I am concerned about your vote for the House American Healthcare Bill. How would the dramatic reductions in federal funding benefit Kansans, especially the disabled and the economically disadvantaged?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. Well, I assume one of the things you're talking about is Medicaid. And, as we deal with trying to balance this federal budget and find savings, we're looking at the entire budget as a whole. Medicaid is increasing much faster than the rate of inflation. We've got to figure out a way to control costs. The proposal I supported would do several things as it relates to Medicaid. It would continue to put an automatic increase that doesn't exist in law now for Medicaid, in which Medicaid would increase every year at the rate of inflation plus an extra percentage point. So it would continue to grow. Maybe that needs to be adjusted, but finding a way in which we can continue to add money every year. So there'd be more money in Medicaid next year than there is this year, greater than the rate of inflation, is part of that proposal. And then as it comes to Medicaid expansion, we continue to allow states, if they expand, but they only get a matching rate at the disabled. So, for example, I think Kansas gets, for every dollar they spend on Medicaid, I think it's maybe 55 cents that the federal government pays, and the state of Kansas has to pay 45 cents. When under the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare, when they expanded Medicaid, they paid 100% of the cost if states would expand into able-bodied adults. Not disabled, but into able-bodied adults. To me, I don't think anyone would want the notion to be, whether Republican or Democrat, that we're going to reimburse states at a higher rate if they put people on Medicaid who are able-bodied and could work versus putting people on Medicaid at the disabled rate, which is 55%. So what this legislation does is have the reimbursement rate at 55% for all of those groups. So if you're disabled, it's a 55% match for the state of Kansas. If you're able-bodied working, it's a 55%. Frankly, it might need to be lower than the disabled rate. But right now, it's 90 to 100% that we're reimbursing states, incentivizing them to put able-bodied adults on as opposed to putting disabled people on there. To me, that's one of the perverse outcomes of the Affordable Care Act that I think all of us would want to fix. So increases in the law that occur every year, and actually giving the putting parity between those and the disabled and the able-bodied workers at a rate at which right now the able-bodied workers have a much better reimbursement rate. So to me, that is a way in which we can do the things we want to do, which is help people who need help, while at the same time trying to control costs at a federal level in which we have a $20 trillion national debt.
We had questions from Lenny Basson on one more healthcare question, then Mike Miller had a question about civility. What's it?
It's Leah.
Leah, I'm sorry. Leah, you're up next. And then Mike Miller had a question on civility. Is Mike here? Right there. Okay, we'll come to you next, Mike.
Will you be willing to work with women and Democrats to repair the ACA?
Well, I know a lot of women Democrats, and there's some in my family even. And, of course, I'd be happy to work with anybody that wants to work towards a solution. And we have met with countless groups. I've met with numbers of groups of folks who really like the ACA and talk to me about what worked for them and how it made a difference in their lives and how they weren't able to receive coverage and now they can. I've also met with countless groups of folks who have lost their doctors and had their premiums go up. And so what I'm willing to do is work with Democratic women, Republican women, conservative women, conservative men. I think all of us have to work together and talk to one another. And regardless of what we see on the evening news and discourse that comes from the administration, my commitment is to be an open ear, to listen to folks, to be willing to work with you or anybody on solutions to build the best healthcare system we want. There are broken parts of Obamacare that have to be fixed. We have to fix it. And there are parts that need to be repealed. And that's what's got to be done. But that doesn't mean we need to pass legislation that would somehow damage the things that people like. So I've made a commitment to keeping provisions that ensure that people with pre-existing conditions can continue to be protected under the law. provisions that would ensure that people under the age of 26 continue to be on their parents' health insurance, that the caps don't go back on, that people lost their coverage. And so I think all those are important. I think all of us are going to have to give and take. That's, to me, is an example of give and take. Those are things that, if you do a straight repeal, it would be gone. We didn't do that. And so I hope that as much as I'd be willing to work with them, they'd be willing to work with me, and I'll extend the hand of friendship and hope they extend it back.
Before we go, let me get Mike. Didn't the House bill limit pre-existing conditions to a state option and allow the states then to drop people from pre-existing?
So that's a good question, Dave. That's a good question. So one of the things specifically says in the law that if you keep continuous coverage, whether you're under a waiver state or not, you can't be denied coverage. Your rates can't go up at a higher rate than anybody else. And in fact, you can lose coverage for 62 days, I believe, for over 2 months, and not pay for that coverage. And I have a lot of families who talk about, we need this coverage, and I know we need this coverage, and we have a child with pre-existing condition, and my heart goes out to them, and I want to make sure that they're not hurt under this bill.
Allow states to have waivers.
Well, they don't have a waiver from that requirement.
But I mean, why not make that a mandatory requirement in the law rather than allow states and others to have a lapse period or continuing coverage?
Yeah, so the requirement under the law, the requirement under the law is that if you keep your coverage and you don't drop it for more than 2 months, that you continue to keep the same rate. And that's in the law for a waiver state, and that's in the law for non-waiver states. Now, what you're asking about is why even have that gap? Why not just say, you could have a gap for 6 months or 2 years? Because we don't want to create an incentive for people to wait to buy insurance until they're sick. Right? We don't want that to be in the law, because that means that healthy people don't get in the markets because they'll wait until they have an accident, until they get sick.
You also want to eliminate the individual mandate in order to...
Right. So that's right. So, no, that's right, Dave. So we eliminate the individual mandate. We eliminate the employer mandate, because when you force people to buy coverage that they can't afford, that they can't use because the deductible is $5,000 or $6,000, you're only giving them coverage in name only. They're still going to the emergency rooms. People are still going to the emergency rooms without coverage. They show up and say, well, I've got Obamacare, and that doesn't cover it because they have huge deductibles. Rates continue to go up, and in places like Johnson and Wyandotte County, there is no insurer right now. Blue Cross Blue Shield pulled out. We're working to get, I think it's Medica, set up for next year, but that's a problem when counties only have one insurer, and there are lots of counties that have no insurer. So we've got to figure out how to repair that, eliminating these mandates from the federal level and looking at different ways to incentivize people to purchase coverage that doesn't involve the federal government telling you what to buy, when to buy, and how you can buy it, to me is an important change that would continue to create a scenario which would make insurance affordable, but create more competition and more choice.
All right, Mike?
Thank you for being here. My question is about the lack of civility in politics today, and the fact that a lot of folks don't want to be involved. They don't like the back and forth, and they don't like the negative connotation. I remember the days of Bob Dole and Nancy Kassebaum, and how well they represented the state, and that they worked across the aisle. You talked a little bit about bipartisanship. What kinds of things are you working on now, particularly with the big issues that have yet to be decided by Congress?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I think that's one that all of us can agree with, that no matter who's in charge, whether Democrats or Republicans are in charge, the House or Senate, the presidency, we want that civility to occur. We want people to talk to one another. We want them to be able to work together. And frankly, we're not going to solve problems any other way. That's the key to getting things done. And so, I've done a number of things to try to lead in that regard. First and foremost, Emanuel Cleaver and I actually chair the Civility Caucus in Congress. And so there's a caucus we actually chair that focuses on this matter. And look, Emanuel Cleaver is a friend of mine, but he and I don't necessarily agree on a number of these issues, just like some of us don't agree. But I think we're trying to lead by example. I think all of us have a commitment, or all of us should have a commitment, whether it is elected members of the House and Senate, whether it's all of us in this room or Americans across the country. We all have to live this every day. And yes, so does the President of the United States. So my commitment is to making sure that my voice, my time, and my energy is focused on a positive civil tone and leading by example in that regard. Now, I'm not always perfect. I sometimes, I have flaws as well, and should do more in that regard or choose my words more carefully. But I work really hard to try to lead by example on that. For some specific things that we work on, I mentioned earlier the Email Privacy Act, which is a pretty critical Fourth Amendment piece of legislation that it took 3 or 4 years to get moving in the House floor. We built that in a bipartisan way. I mentioned the child care care tax credit. That's a bill we're building in a bipartisan way that will hopefully really have an impact on tax reform and make sure it's focused on workers. NIH is an area in which I've worked with my colleagues on the other side of the line to increase medical research funding, and we've now had back-to-back of the biggest increases in NIH medical research science funding in 13 years. Bigger than when the Democrats were in Congress, bigger than in the previous Republican Congress. That's a $4 billion increase on a $30 billion original amount over 18 months. I wrote a combined letter with Emmanuel Cleaver back in February that wrote a letter to the presidency and to the president and the administration saying, do not place any cuts in your budget to the Violence Against Women Act, that we will not support those reductions. And I led with him on that. And so there's 3 or 4 examples, and there are a number of more that we're working on. I've got a very important immigration bill that has over 240 co-sponsors that would eliminate the arbitrary per-country caps that affect who can get green cards in this country, that have created a significant, huge backlog in certain countries that might take 60 or 70 years for people to get a green card because they're from one of these 2 or 3 countries. So we want to fix immigration. We want to do these things, and I fundamentally believe that we need to work together to get there. Okay, thank you. And we need to be able to talk to one another. And I would say, lastly, our Congress came together this summer, and it does sometimes during tragedy, when one of my colleagues, Steve Scalise, was shot at a baseball game by a person who had a list of Republicans that he wanted to kill. That's sort of another realm. That's beyond what we're used to in terms of the anger in this country. And so we've got to, all of us, work together to solve this problem. I can't solve it alone. And none of us can, but if we're all doing our part each day to make a ripple, as my friend Minnie Corcoran says, to be able to spread that love and kindness, be kind to one another, it starts with us, and I'll make sure I do my part. Thank you.
We'll take another question from Facebook Live. Janet Williams is watching on Facebook, and she asks if you will name a bloated government program. If indeed federal government is too big, where do you start cutting? What's bloated?
Well, we have made a number of cuts in a number of areas, but we can certainly go through. Of course, the EPA is one that I think has had a number of bloated expenses. I think there are cuts that can be made. Listen, I think there are cuts we can make in the Department of Defense. I think there's bureaucracy and waste in the Department of Defense. I don't think this is immune to a Republican-type agency or a Democrat-type agency. The federal government is expensive and bloated. And, as we look at regulation after regulation that's come forward, I'll just give you an example of how that affects all of us. So we've passed these these Congressional Review Act bills in the House. I think we passed 14 of them. And they've gone on to be signed by the president. It's estimated that will save $4 billion in the economy and $42 million or 42 million hours in compliance costs. It's now estimated that our regulatory costs that we pay as taxpayers in the expenses of the things we buy and things we do and the consumption we do is greater than our federal income tax costs. So sure, it's not just the general inefficiencies that are in government that we all know are there, that it's it's hard to legislate out, but we try to make reductions in efficiencies. But it's also reducing the burdens that we're putting on working Americans and small businesses and all of us in this room that make our electric bills go up, that make our grocery bills go up, and ultimately those things hit the working folks the most in this country.
David, Megan Peters had a question about hate speech, and then Jamie McGinn had a question about gun legislation. Is Jamie here as well? Great. David, over here when you're done there.
All right, Megan, it's all yours.
The rhetoric from the White House regarding refugees, specifically Muslim refugees, has been divisive and dangerous, and I believe this has contributed to an environment where hate crimes, like the one here in Olathe back in February, are more and more common. How do you plan to step up, combat this hate speech, and make America a safe haven for all who reside within your district?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think the first thing is that we need to speak out very clearly when we see something that's discriminatory or prejudicial or hateful and call it for what it is. And of course, that's what I've been doing and a number of us have been doing since the Charlotte tragedy and incident. I think that we need to certainly choose our words carefully in all these matters. I do think when it comes to refugees, we have a responsibility to ensure that whoever's coming into the country, they're coming in, they've been vetted, that they're coming in and they have, whether it's refugees or any immigrants in the country, and that we can ensure their safety. That being said, I don't believe in a religious test to get in this country. I don't believe that we should discriminate against certain groups, but I do think there are regions of the world that we've had difficulties in vetting individuals and ensuring that that we have background checks on them because they're regions that it's been very difficult to do. And we have a commitment, and I have an obligation, first and foremost, to the safety of the American people. That being said, you can do that without incentivizing or encouraging or ignoring hateful speech when it happens. The tragedy at Austin's in Olathe struck very close to home for many of us. I have a lot of Indian friends in this community. I know people that are very close to the people that were shot, and of course the ultimate victim. We ultimately had to help the widow ensure that she could stay in the country because our immigration laws are so complicated, and partly because of the bill I mentioned earlier with this gentleman regarding the green card process, that we had to worry whether she was going to get deported because her husband had been murdered. And so I think it's important that we speak out about that. And I worked really hard after that incident a couple days later to get the president in his speech to a joint session of Congress to include his declaration of a description and discuss with that incident that happened here in Olathe. And so that's what I've been trying to do, is to pressure the White House to make those statements. And when they don't make statements that I think are consistent with our values of kindness, loving one another in our community, then I will speak out on that. Thank you.
Jamie McGinn, and then Dan Ferguson had a question about guns, if Dan's here as well. Okay, and David, right to your right in the back after Jamie.
All right. Jamie?
All right.
Fire away.
That's odd, considering the topic. You have consistently voted against, and Congress has consistently voted against, any strengthening of regulations around guns. So I'm wondering if you believe gun violence is a problem in the country. I know you've mentioned the tragedy at the baseball field. If so, what are your ideas to address the problem, or what methods would you support?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, I do think gun violence is a problem in this country, and we look at the evening news here in Kansas City, or we read stories across the country, Chicago and other areas. We see this on the nightly news, and it's heartbreaking. Every time there's a shooting in our community, I think all of us are heartbroken to see that, because that could be our family, that could be someone we know. In some cases, it is. I don't think the answer is restricting rights for law-abiding Americans, tax-paying, law-abiding Americans who restricting their Second Amendment rights isn't going to make them feel any safer. When I go to Washington, D.C., I'm in the biggest gun-free zone, and probably in America, where you're not allowed to carry a gun in Washington, D.C., and there's areas there where you might want to, but you're not allowed to protect yourself. That's not the country I want to live in. I do think that we've got to be better in terms of law enforcement. We need to do better in terms of working with our communities. We've seen problems in certainly racial tensions, and of course Ferguson last year. And so I think we need to build better relations between folks in our communities in terms of with law enforcement. I believe that in some cases mental health issues need to be invested in, and we need to have better training, and I've supported those measures. So I think there are a whole host of things to do, but I don't think the answer is taking away constitutional rights from folks that aren't committing crimes and want to protect themselves.
Dan Ferguson.
Dan?
Just to push back, because I had a similar question to,
Sure.
to her, and I've communicated with your office a lot in terms
Thank
of
you.
legislation, and thank you for responses. And mental health is one thing that comes
Yep.
up. I would agree with that mental health is a huge part of it. But if you look at our rate of gun homicides in this country compared to other developed countries around the world of mass shootings, it is, we are astronomically higher. And the one consistent thing there is gun ownership. And you mentioned taking rights away from lawful owners. There have been poll after poll that says 90+% of gun owners want straw man purchases gone, want stricter background checks. We had 20 elementary school children literally executed in a school in Connecticut a few years ago, and yet we've chosen not to take guns away from everyone, but military style assault rifles, things, just common sense legislation. And we sit and we pray and we talk about mental health, but nothing ever gets done about taking
Mm-hmm.
away. And that's what I'd like to know.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Mm-hmm. I'll try to address some of the specifics you mentioned. Again, my heart breaks along with yours does, and I know that's not the answer, right? We pray, and right, and these are tragedies that we need to figure out a way to solve. So we have to look at specifically what's happening in the tragedies, what went wrong, and how we could potentially solve some of these issues. Many of these are different. You mentioned the Newtown, shooting. Obviously, it wasn't a straw man purchase, wasn't a background check issue. This is someone who had mental illness who grabbed his mother's guns, I guess, and of course went to school. Better school security, of course, we do that a lot here in our community, would be helpful in that manner. I don't know how some of the specific measures. I think my fear is, to your question, is that we have a tragedy, and on one side, the one side says, well, all you guys are doing is praying, and the other side says, well, all you guys are doing is just dreaming up a new gun regulation that wouldn't have had anything to do, wouldn't have affected the shooting, right? So I think we need to have an honest dialogue about what our rights are as Americans, and what would have made an impact. The things you mentioned, straw man purchases are already illegal in the United States. Background checks occur for any licensed gun dealer when they sell a gun. That already occurs in the United States of America. We don't do the checks or don't force them on private person-to-person sales. I know that's what some people have suggested. That wouldn't have saved, in many of these cases, there's not a real example of that occurring. Many of these guns, in some cases, are owned illegally. So I think there are a number of things you can do, but that doesn't involve restricting the Second Amendment rights of folks who are not committing these crimes. And I think in many cases, the folks who would commit these crimes and continue to commit these crimes aren't going to follow the laws anyway. You tell them, well, you can't have an illegal gun. In many cases, the gun violence we're talking about in the inner cities and in these things where we see the shootings every day at night, many of these weapons aren't legal. Many of these weapons aren't gone. They don't go down to the local store, purchase these weapons, do a background check, and then go in and do a drive-by shooting. So I think there are a number of different things we're talking about here, and I think we need to talk about what actually works and what doesn't affect the constitutional rights of Americans in that process. I'm sure we can do, work together with you and make sure we have that. That's my point. We need to know exactly what we're talking about. So if we say Newtown, and then we say we need to change straw purchases, I just think there's a real fear on folks that every time there's a shooting that just as much as there's concern by folks on the right who are, not willing to look at anything, there's also folks on the left that say, well, this is a time to talk about, something that is unrelated to what's occurred, that didn't cause that hasn't caused this matter, as an excuse to come up with a new gun regulation. So I want to get past all that and have an honest dialogue about what's happening. And to you, sir, and I'd be happy to continue that and look forward to doing so, because I do think it's important. I think we're all concerned about it.
The Corporon shooting was a straw purchase.
Right, and it was illegal.
The family just
right.
had a settlement with Walmart.
Right.
But there are definitely issues there with how do companies sell the guns, and how do we still get around our straw purchase laws?
Well, those are things we can certainly talk about, but what the straw man purchases are illegal in this country, right? That's the whole point, is that if someone's not able to buy a gun, someone else can't come in and purchase their gun. What we need to do, Mary, I think you make a good point. We need to enforce the laws on the books. And if we could get that done, I think we don't need more laws, frankly, in this matter. We need to enforce the laws that are on the books. We need to deal with the backlogs and the background checks. We need to follow up on them when they come up negative, which we haven't done in previous administrations, to say, wait, you tried to purchase a gun that you were not legally allowed to have. That's a great follow-up opportunity. That doesn't happen frequently enough. So I think enforcing the laws is key to here, not developing a whole new patchwork of laws that ultimately will probably tie up legal gun owners who are defending themselves, and the folks that aren't going to follow the laws will get them anyway.
Well, I think the question is, find out why they're not being.
Yeah, why was someone able to do a straw man purchase? Right.
Congressman David Guth is watching on Facebook Live, and he has a question for you about the president.
Okay.
He says, since President Trump lies about small things, how can you trust him on the big stuff?
Okay. Well, I would say, again, whether it was President Obama or whether it's President Trump, there have been plenty of concerns. Well, that's fine. That's fine.
Do you trust President Trump?
The president.
Hang on.
You know, I don't know who lies in this country, right? I don't. But I will say that the president, I believe, gets up every day with the best interest of this country at heart. That he ran for office to make this country better. That he is working as hard as he can to do that. That he is not a professional politician. I wish he wouldn't, certainly necessarily tweet every single day, but at the same time, I take the people I meet in this job, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, whether it's a Democrat or Republican president, at face value. I believe their motives are pure, and I will continue to do that. I know folks don't like that, but that's my position. Yeah. Okay.
Cassandra Peters had a question about gay rights, and Barbara Rouge had a question about poverty. Is Cassandra here? Yeah. And Barbara Rouge? Great. Up front here then.
Hi. Your constituents include members of the LGBT community, and you have never sponsored or co-sponsored any pro-LGBT legislation. Can we please hear directly from you why we're not worthy of protection from discrimination in employment and housing?
Okay. Well, I'd be interested to hear the legislation you're talking about, but I will say that I don't believe that we should discriminate against anybody and for any reason. And so, if we need to look at additional laws to do that, of course, I'm certainly open to that. I don't want to create opportunities for new litigation. I don't want to create opportunities for, trial lawyers to take advantage of that situation. But if people are being taken advantage of and discriminated against that country, it's wrong. I will tell you, when the president issued a transgender ban in the military, I came out with a statement that I disagreed with that. Okay. At the same time, I don't think our United States military should be paying for sex changes. So I'm trying to represent all the viewpoints of a very diverse district here and trying to protect and make sure there's not discrimination. At the same time, I don't think our government needs to be in the business of paying for a number of these things in the military. So I guess that's not fully answering in terms of the legislation. I have to look at the bills you're referencing, but I don't believe in discrimination, and I don't think that people should not be able to serve or be part of the military or be part of our country because of their sexual or gender identity.
Barbara, raise your hand for Dave, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I sneak over that way, Barbara.
Well, Congressman, mine is, I wouldn't say it's poverty. My question was, I work. I don't make a lot of money at my job, but I go to work every day. I drive a 20-year-old car, and I'm paying over half my paycheck every 2 weeks to stay in my apartment. And I don't qualify for housing because my income is high enough that I don't qualify. But yet I feel like I'm spinning on a hamster wheel here because I'm not making it. I have a college education, and I just want to know, is there something out there for people like me?
Yeah, thank you for your question. There's been this sort of conversation about the silent majority out there that works, that doesn't get a lot of benefits from the government, that pays their taxes, that puts food on the table, raises their kids. It's not looking for a handout, not looking for someone else to solve their problems, but they're doing their job, they're doing their part, and that's what this country's made for. This is a country, I think, the greatest poverty-breaking program in the history of this country is the free enterprise system, giving everybody the chance and the tools by investing in things like education, job training, and everybody the chance to rise and fall on their own merits. That's a new concept, frankly, that the United States was a leading country in years ago when we were founded. For thousands of years in this world, you had to sort of do what your parents did, you had to what your father did or your mother did. That was sort of what you ended up doing. We developed a new country in which everyone had the rights protected in the Constitution, their inalienable rights, so that they had the freedom to do what they want to do, to practice the religion they want to practice, to speak out like they want to practice, yes, the Second Amendment, all the amendments in the Constitution, those are rights that are protected for Americans. And as part of that, we ensure that everybody has the chance to realize the American dream, that everyone like yourself that's working hard, that's paying their bills. My job each and every day when I get up is to think about those folks, to reduce the burdens of the federal government on them, keep their taxes down, to try to make things more affordable. And I see our federal government over and over again making it harder in many ways on working Americans. Every regulation has a cost. those regulations ultimately are borne out and paid for by folks that are working in this country. Every tax that's paid somewhere ultimately trickles down and is paid for by working folks. We talk a lot about trickle down economics. I'm also concerned about trickle down government and the cost of all that, and the benefits don't end up with the people that are paying the bills. When you look at certain regulations, the so-called Clean Power Plan. Clean Power Plan would have cost Kansas City Power and Light, for example, $6, $7, $8 billion. Who ultimately pays those rates? The ratepayers. You do. So when you say you're working hard to pay your rent, you're also working hard to pay your electric bill and all of your expenses. Some of that's the cost of government. And so we've got to figure out ways to reduce that, to make it easier on you. And then ultimately what we also want is to have everyone have the chance to find the jobs that they want in this country. We want employers to stay in the United States. We don't want jobs being shipped overseas. We want them staying here in the United States. That's where tax reform comes into play. That's where regulatory comes into play. We want these companies to stay in places like Kansas City and hire workers here and pay them good wages. And so that's important as well. This morning, for example, I had a job fair in Kansas City, Kansas. A 4-hour job fair where I brought about 100 employers together, and people coming in, and I was linking up employers and workers so that they could find the job opportunities for them. And so my goal ultimately is to give the folks that want to work and that want to achieve the tools to do that, and to continue to make America the best country in the world, because we create chances for everyone to rise. And as I see government making that harder on people, I'm going to fight that every step of the way. So thank you for your question.
Congressman, another question from someone watching at home. Rohit Nagdio wants to ask you about immigration.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on Senator Tom Cotton's RAISE Act? People waiting for green cards for decades would have to reapply.
Right. I don't support it. I believe we need immigration reform in this country. I think our immigration system is completely backwards. We incentivize people to come into the country illegally, and we make it very difficult for people to come here legally. We create tremendous backlogs, which also makes the illegal system hard to fix. And so I believe we have a real chance to reform the broken immigration system. I think this Congress ought to tackle that. Thought the last Congress should have. I'm putting my own reform ideas on the line. I have introduced, or I'm the lead sponsor now of a bill called the Fairness for High Skilled Workers Act. There are 1.2 million people waiting for green cards in this country. Of those, we give 120,000 green cards out each year. Of those 120,000, we only allow 7% of those to go to one country. What this has created is a huge backlog in countries like India and China, such that if you are an Indian person who's here, Indian immigrants here on an H-1B visa, and you are working in a high-skilled tech job, and you might have, even if you have just a bachelor's degree, in one of the categories, the lines, it could take 70 years to get a green card. Whereas if the person sitting next to you, maybe he's from South Korea or some other country that doesn't have, they don't hit the cap, you could get a green card in 2 or 3 years. That to me is patently unfair. We're treating certain communities in this country like indentured servants, not allowing them the same rights as other countries. It's discriminatory. So I'm fighting against that. I don't support the RAISE Act because I don't think it's heading us in the right direction. Legal immigration is part of our heritage. Most of us were, came to this country because of immigration. We need a good, strong legal process. I think we need much better border security. I think we need a better entry-exit visa system, so when people overstay their visas, we know that they've overstayed it, that we have the ability to track that. We don't do a very good job of that right now. People don't exit, we just don't know. Consequently, we have 10 million more people here that don't have good status. That's a problem. And we've got to fix that, and it starts with better border security, and it starts with fixing the legal immigration system so that it meets the needs of the economy while ensuring that Americans, of course, have the opportunities for jobs first.
Nick Maurer had a question about spending, and then Deb Fetter had a question about jobs. Nick and Deb? You're Nick? Is Deb here? You're great. Right behind you then, Dave, for Deb.
So, Congressman Yoder, you serve on the House Appropriations Committee, which over the past few months has approved appropriations bills for each of its 12 subcommittees. And you mentioned earlier that at the end of July, you passed the bill to appropriate national defense funding. So my question is, could you go into detail about how you are working to personally ensure that you're reining in government spending while still maintaining government programs that are important to Kansans? And also, how would you say that this year's appropriation process is helping the House return to regular order?
Right. Thank you for the question. Well, I've had the opportunity on your behalf to serve on the House Appropriations Committee for the last 7 years. because of the sequester and other efforts to keep the lid on federal spending, we've been able to keep those dollars down, and we're still spending less on discretionary spending in this country than we were when Republicans took over Congress in 2011. So I think part of it is an effort to keep a slow growth or a lid on that federal spending and spend our time working to eliminate programs, duplicative programs, to make government more efficient, to eliminate or reduce programs that we don't think are as effective, and there's a long list of those that we have done already and that we're doing again in this year's legislation, and then enhance the things that we think are important. So I happen to think that funding for the National Institutes of Health is very important. I think researching to find cures to cancer and Alzheimer's and heart disease and Parkinson's and diabetes, the 10,000 diseases that occur in this world, that we find cures to them. We have cures to about 500 of them right now. To me, it'd be a pretty good investment, and maybe the best way we could all agree to combat the rampant rise in healthcare costs is to cure Alzheimer's. They estimate by 2050, the Alzheimer's Association, that we will be spending as a country over $1 trillion annually on healthcare costs for that one disease. $1 trillion annually. Yet we're only spending right now $500 million annually researching a cure for Alzheimer's. So I've argued that we should double the amount of NIH spending over the course of the next decade to invest in finding cures to those diseases from a standpoint of saving lives, saving our loved ones, saving resources and dollars, because we wouldn't having the expense that goes along with a lot of the care when folks get something like Alzheimer's, and then of course creating lots of jobs. So there's lots of things that certainly occur and that we could do. I think there's smart investments and there's bad investments in terms of federal dollars. Those are things I like to invest in. That's where I'm focused on keeping our Kansas priorities together. Another example of that would be early childhood education, helping young children get into Head Start and other programs. We've championed putting more dollars into that while taking away dollars from other programs that were less effective. In terms of regular order, one of the problems we have is we have been unable for 40 years, 4 times Congress, whether Democrats or Republicans have been in charge, 4 times have they gotten all 12 bills signed into law by the president. And about that many times, I think it's been 6 times in 50 years roughly, that may be off slightly, have we had a balanced budget in that time. So this is not a Republican problem or a Democratic problem. It's a common sense problem. And so I've been working with my colleagues. I have a great Democratic member of the committee that I chair, the Legislative Branch Subcommittee, and we've been working to keep costs down for the legislative branch, for our own offices. I myself, I return dollars every year to the U.S. Treasury from my office. I don't spend it all. Right? I think that's important. Cutting expenses, leading by example. And so we do that in the legislative branch. We're still spending less on the legislative branch today than we were spending in 2010 and 2011 when Republicans took over the House. And so leading by example in that regard, cutting out waste, and investing in things that really matter to us. Hopefully that's something we can all get behind. I think it's consistent with our Kansas values. Thanks for the question.
Yep. Deb Fetter.
As you mentioned earlier, Kansas recently experimented with stimulating the economy through a series of tax cuts that you talked about earlier at the state level, and our legislature has recently moved to radically reverse the effects of it in an effort to right-size our state programs and growth. Given that all good programs balance a state and federal initiative, can you describe your vision and specific steps that you would take to help stimulate the economy and bring job growth to Kansas, assuming that tax cuts and just rolling back regulations are not viable options?
Well, thank you for the question, and I appreciate that because it's a whole list of things that we need to do. Number one, and we've talked about it, so I won't belabor all of it, but we need to reduce the burdens on small business, on individuals, on folks like the lady who asked the question earlier about working families, and that starts with tax reforms, tax simplification, reducing rates. It starts with reducing regulations and reducing those costs. That is an important facet of this. Those 2 steps. The third step would be investing in things like I've discussed, investing in the medical research I discussed, or investing in infrastructure, building roads and bridges, a highway plan, investing in early childhood education, things where we get the biggest bang for our buck. I think working on good trade deals. Trade is very important to Kansas. Trade is very important to Kansas City. Agriculture, we create a lot of jobs when we have good trade deals. So I think TPP obviously was shelved. Both President Trump and candidate Clinton both ran against it. I think the country sort of decided TPP wasn't the right way to go. Maybe they want us to go to more bilateral agreements. But good, smart trade deals that are fair to the American people have to be negotiated because we need to be able to export goods from Kansas, wheat and meat products. Recently, the president just worked a negotiated deal with China to get beef sold to China for the first time in years. China's consumption of beef has gone up dramatically in the last 15 years, and we haven't been able to sell to them because there's been an embargo on China buying American beef. That's now open to Kansas farmers, Kansas livestock producers. I am the co-chair of the Congressional Beef Caucus. I work with a Democrat in another state to try to be able to sell more Kansas meat products around the world. And so I think from reducing the burdens of government to from taxes and regulations, and I've spoken about a number of those, from energy costs to regulatory costs from the EPA and in general, to investing in things that matter like infrastructure and medical research and education, to trade deals that will allow us to export more goods. I think those are some examples of how I think in this very divided country, we can talk to each other, Republicans and Democrats, and say, this is good for the American people, this is good to create jobs, this is good to grow our economy. And ultimately, folks, if we can get to 3 or 4% growth, you get to 4% growth, you create millions of more jobs. You bring trillions of dollars into the federal government to pay down the debt. And if you can do that, while this young man's question about keeping spending down, you actually start paying down the national debt. You actually start at least reducing the deficit, get to a point where you can have a national balanced budget. So there's a recipe here for success, and I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the line can work together to get there. Thank you.
Congressman, we're getting down to the end of our program here this evening. I wanted to ask one more Facebook Live question. This is from Scott Koppel. He wants to know, what are your thoughts, Congressman, on the fact that next year a person born at the start of the Afghanistan war will be old enough to have served in it?
Yeah. Well, we all remember September 11th and the terrorists that came from parts of the world that had been training in Afghanistan. And I think we all at that point, I think there's been some debate since then. I think the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War probably looked at differently in history. But we've been there a long time regardless, back since right after September 11th. I thought the president this week laid out a strategy to try to go resolve this, to try to go win this. I think the artificial timetables, the declaration of withdrawals, the specific troop levels has telegraphed to our enemies to wait us out and has had the wrong standard by which we gauge success. The success we want is the safety and security of everybody in this room, right? We have to decide as American people what we think takes to get there. I think we saw in Iraq in the sort of ISIS region that a withdrawal of hard-fought security that we shed lives of our own constituents, people that I know personally, who I've cried with, their families, have sacrificed. There's been a lot of sacrifice in these wars. We don't want that to be in vain. I think our job as members of Congress is to make sure we have good oversight, that we are ensure that as the president engages, that we're following the dollars, that we are ensuring that we're not putting lives in jeopardy, and that we're investing in our military to give them the protection they need, the resources they need to have the most advanced weaponry, to keep them as safe as possible. I think that's our commitment to them, and we've done that in recent appropriations bills that we passed in a bipartisan way, by the way. Republicans, Democrats came together, passed legislation that put significant dollars into national defense that the president signed into law. Now, that's not going to cover the evening news night after night because of maybe a tweet the president said or whatever news item is more interesting to folks. But there's a lot of good policies like that that have moved through this Congress that the president has signed into law that help support our troops, that help take care of our veterans. That's all part of this conversation. And so my hope is that we can carry out the mission there and stabilize and secure the region, and that we can push on Pakistan and other regional countries to do their part to root out terrorism in their countries as well.
So, Congressman, as we wrap up tonight, we heard as we prepared for this event a lot from your constituents, giving us their thoughts about your service as their congressman. We also heard some questions about your future, so we could close with a quick yes or no question about, will you run for governor in 2018, or are you going to be running for this seat again?
I'm not planning on running for governor. I am planning on running for re-election. But to be honest with you, one of the problems I think we all have is election fatigue. The election was in November. We immediately turned to the 2018 election. We'll immediately turn to the 2020 election. My commitment to all of you in the room and everybody watching at home is to get up every day, work as hard as I can to represent you, represent your families in a very divided country, in a community that has lots of Republicans and lots of Democrats, many of whom disagree very strongly on matters, and to do my part to try to unify us, to try to work together to solve problems. And then someday we'll probably get to politics once again and probably get to the elections. But in the meantime, I think it's important that I do my job and that I work with each one of you to get things done to continue to build the country we all believe in, that we all want to see for our kids and grandkids. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And with a star, would like to thank everyone who joined us in person and everyone who watched on Facebook Live. Also, the City of Olathe for hosting us. We hope to do this again in the future. And thanks for being here tonight. Good night.